Statues. We all see them from time to time, but most of us don't pay them much mind. Today, we really only see a few statues in city centers, but not much more than that. Often, we don't even know who's depicted, like, who even is Tom L. Johnson? Oh, apparently he was a famous Cleveland mayor who set up the Cleveland Civic Center and public transportation services. Yeah, that warrants a statue. Anyway, seeing statues honoring someone is relatively rare in today's America. Unless you're in a public park within a city, you won't see that many. Yeah, that wasn't the case for ancient Rome. Ancient Rome was full of statues. Everywhere you looked, there were statues honoring a senator or an emperor, or someone from the Roman pantheon. In just one site in Rome, there were 3,845 statues found. I would classify over 3,000 statues placed in one single area as kind of a lot. That number certainly beats the measly 7-ish we have in Cleveland's public square. Statues from this area mostly depict either senators or emperors, with an occasional Roman god popping up. In the Forum of Trajan, a public area filled with statues, a minimum of 20 senatorial statues have been found. Well, to be more specific, the statues have long since disappeared, but the inscriptions of the statues have been found. According to those inscriptions, the statues were made of bronze, possibly explaining why the statues are gone. They were looted. These statues were created in the mid to late 4th century, when emperors were less present in the functions of the Roman Empire, especially compared to earlier periods. Taking the senatorial statues together, it implies that Rome had a strong senatorial class with widespread publicity by the 4th century. Because I don't want to spend the next 53 years of my life discussing every single statue that archaeologists have ever found in the remains of Rome, let's examine just one. Now, I can't exactly go to Rome to look at a statue, so I'm going to the Art Museum. Here in Cleveland, one of the largest Roman statues on display is titled The Emperor as Philosopher, probably Marcus Aurelius. A thrilling title, I know. This statue was made from at least 29, count 'em, 29 separate pieces. The hollow bronze pieces were then expertly joined together by whoever actually crafted the statue. One obvious problem you might notice is that the statue doesn't have a head. Over the approximately 1,840 years since the statue was created, the headpiece or headpieces have been lost. Because the head is gone, historians aren't 100% confident who this statue is depicting, but the general consensus is that it depicts the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. This is for a few reasons that we'll discuss later. Alright, let's talk about how Rome worked before we get into how statues like the one in the Art Museum fit into the situation. First, how was the Roman Empire structured? Like many civilizations, the Roman Empire divided itself up into several distinct classes. In Rome's case, this social structure was incredibly rigid, with the amount of land a man held dictating his class. The early form of a Roman caste system was the patrician class and the plebeians, although this structure lost most of its power as time passed. The patrician class was composed of the privileged families in Rome. As women were barred from holding most roles outside the home, the family status depended on the roles of men. Male members of the family held several positions in the Roman Empire, and were often magistrates, religious figures, or were part of the Roman cavalry. The plebeians were, well, all the rest. They were farmers, craftsmen, or foot soldiers mainly. As time marched on, a more complex social structure was developed. This was the empire of aristocracy, or the empire of nobles. On top, there was the senatorial class, then the equestrian class, also called the equites. These two classes composed of what is called the ordo. Under them were the municipal senators, or the decurions. Below them were the freedmen, then slaves and free poor. Everyone under the ordo classes were called the plebeians. and in this context didn't matter. While the social structure of the Roman Empire was rigid, it wasn't unmoving. Most people changed their social class once or several times within their lives. The freedmen and slaves were the, quote, most upwardly mobile, but members of all classes were subject to move up or down. This is the structure in which Roman sculptures were made. Moving back to the statue of Marcus Aurelius, you might note that nothing in the art museum denotes who made the statue. In fact, if you look at other statues from the Roman Empire, virtually none of the statues say who was responsible for the actual creation of the art. Based on this limited information, what can we know about Roman sculptors? Well, historians have determined that artists were either from the slave or freedman classes. In short, they didn't matter. They had no social standing and no artistic control over the works they made. Art for art's sake was pretty uncommon in Rome. Senators or emperors would commission nameless artists to create their likenesses out of stone. To Rome, statues were often a tool of propaganda, not one of true artistic expression. Thus, we have no idea who specifically made the statue of the emperor as philosopher. We can safely assume that they were either a slave or freedman, and didn't create the work just because they felt like making a statue that day. The sculptors themselves weren't that important in Rome, but those who got carved were. The imperial senators and emperors were of vital importance to the empire. The most recognizable figures of the Roman age are probably the emperors themselves. Unlike several other cultures, Rome didn't follow the divine king philosophy. Roman emperors ruled because they convinced enough people that they were the best man for the job, without any divine intervention or powers. That is, at least until a massive imperial cult formed around the emperors a little while later, but we're not going to worry about that. To help keep their elevated status up, emperors frequently commissioned statues in their likenesses. Statues often fell within the emperor's propaganda department. Really, how many statues do you know of that depict an emperor like the sad picture of Napoleon? Because an emperor's public presence was largely dependent on statues, emperors slowly gained more and more control over sculptures. Of course, the emperors did not have a monopoly on statues. The imperial senators would also commission sculptures. These senatorial statues were no less impressive than those created for emperors. In fact, the statues for emperors, quote, usually had the same size and appearance as statues put up for aristocrats. Alright, so we've established how statues fit into Rome as a whole, but now let's look at a specific example. As stated previously, I'll be looking at the emperor as philosopher, probably Marcus Aurelius. So, who was Marcus Aurelius? To keep it brief, Marcus Aurelius was a Roman emperor who ruled from 161 to 180 AD. He is very well known today, partly because of his extensive portraiture. Marcus Aurelius was depicted in all stages of his life, including 1. A young prince, 2. A militarily strong yet merciful ruler, and 3. An old, disillusioned philosopher. His most famous statue is from the second phase, where he is depicted as a grand warrior riding his horse into battle. Marcus didn't stay as this great grand warrior, however. As he aged, he became increasingly worried about the state of the empire and turned to philosophy. This philosopher king persona lasted until his death in 180. Our statue of the emperor as philosopher fits this chronology very well. It was created when Marcus was older and depicts him as a philosopher, which is consistent with other statues of Marcus from this time. Because of both the time when it was created and how the emperor is depicted as a wise philosopher, historians are fairly confident that this statue is Marcus Aurelius, even without being able to see the original head. Roman statues can tell us a lot about Rome itself. The sculptures themselves didn't matter, but the senators and emperors who were depicted did. Much of Roman sculpture was just a copy of earlier Greek works, but Rome did make significant advances in the whole sculpture as a tool of propaganda game. All in all, statues from the Roman Empire tell us that poor people were inconsequential and only the rich mattered. Oh, how times have changed.